The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Cedar Valley like a whispered secret, and in the old timber barn at the edge of the Thornfield Ranch, Emma Mitchell pressed herself against the weathered wooden slats, her heart hammering against her ribs. In her arms, 3-month-old Lucy gurgled softly, blissfully unaware of the danger that had driven them to seek refuge in this forgotten corner of Montana territory. Beside them, an unusual companion kept watch, a milk goat named Duchess, whose most peculiar feature was the small burgundy hat perched jauntily between her ears, a remnant from Emma's previous life as a traveling performer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1882 had been unforgiving to Emma Mitchell, though she bore little resemblance to the confident woman who had once commanded audiences across the eastern states with her theatrical performances. Her once pristine traveling costume now hung in tatters, stained with mud and the inevitable marks of motherhood. Her auburn hair, formerly styled in elaborate coils, now escaped in wild tendrils from beneath a faded bonnet. Yet her green eyes still held that spark of determination that had carried her through countless performances, even as exhaustion threatened to extinguish it entirely. The baby in her arms was not her own by blood, a fact that made their situation all the more precarious. Lucy was the daughter of Emma's dearest friend Margaret, who had perished in childbirth just weeks after her husband died in a mining accident outside of Helena. With her dying breath, Margaret had pressed the infant into Emma's arms and whispered a desperate plea that would change everything. The child's paternal grandfather, a wealthy and ruthless man named Cornelius Blackwood, had already sent men to claim what he considered his property. But Margaret had made Emma swear an oath that Lucy would never fall into those grasping hands, not after what Blackwood had done to his own son for marrying beneath his station. Emma had been fleeing for nearly a month now, moving from town to town, always one step ahead of Blackwood's hired trackers. Her small savings from her performing days had dwindled to nothing, and desperation had driven her to attempt something she had never done before: theft. The general store in the nearby town of Willowbrook had seemed like an easy target, but her inexperience had betrayed her. The storekeeper had spotted her slipping a loaf of bread and a tin of milk into her worn satchel, and within minutes the sheriff was hot on her trail. That chase had led her here, to this barn that seemed abandoned, where she now crouched in the hayloft with Lucy and Duchess, praying that her pursuers would pass by without investigating too closely. The goat had been Margaret's as well, a gift from her late husband, who had found the animal wearing the tiny hat and decided it was too charming to remove. Duchess had proven surprisingly loyal, following Emma and the baby across hundreds of miles of rough terrain, her hat somehow managing to stay perfectly positioned despite their harrowing journey. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made Emma's blood turn to ice. She pulled Lucy closer, placing a gentle hand over the baby's mouth to muffle any sounds, while Duchess seemed to sense the danger and remained perfectly still. Through the gaps in the barn boards, Emma could see 3 men on horseback circling the structure. Their leader, a thin man with a face like a weasel, called out in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air. "Sheriff says she came this way, boys. Woman with a baby and some kind of animal can't have gone far on foot." The man's voice held a cruel edge that made Emma's skin crawl. These weren't just local lawmen pursuing a petty thief, these were Blackwood's men, and they had finally caught up to her trail. Emma closed her eyes and tried to quiet her breathing, but Lucy chose that moment to emit a soft whimper. The sound seemed to echo through the barn like a gunshot, and Emma heard the horses draw closer. Heavy boots hit the ground, and she knew with sinking certainty that they would search every inch of the building. "Check the loft," came the command, and Emma heard the creak of the ladder as someone began to climb. Her mind raced through impossible options. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She looked down at Lucy's innocent face and felt a fierce surge of protective instinct. Whatever happened to her, she would not let these men take this child back to a grandfather who viewed her as nothing more than a possession to be controlled. The footsteps reached the top of the ladder, and Emma pressed herself deeper into the corner, knowing it was futile. A shadow fell across the hay-strewn floor as the tracker moved closer, and she could hear his heavy breathing as he searched methodically through the scattered bales and abandoned equipment. "Well, well," came a voice from directly above her hiding spot. "What do we have here?" Emma looked up to find herself staring into the cold, calculating eyes of Blackwood's lead tracker. The man's hand moved slowly toward the pistol at his hip, and a triumphant smile spread across his weathered features. Behind him, his companions had climbed up as well, effectively cutting off any hope of escape. "Mrs. Emma Mitchell, I presume," the tracker said with mock courtesy. "Mr. Blackwood has been most anxious to make your acquaintance, and to reclaim what rightfully belongs to him." His eyes moved to the baby in her arms, and Emma instinctively turned away, as if she could shield Lucy from his predatory gaze. "The child stays with me," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Her mother entrusted her to my care." The tracker laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, miss. Mr. Blackwood has legal documents establishing his guardianship. You, on the other hand, are a wanted fugitive who's been harboring stolen property. She's not property, Emma said fiercely. She's a human being. Tell that to the judge, the tracker replied, motioning to his men. Take the child. Carefully, Mr. Blackwood wants his granddaughter delivered in perfect condition. As the men moved forward, Emma made what she knew might be her final act of defiance. She stood up to her full height, cradling Lucy protectively, and backed toward the edge of the loft. Below them, the barn floor seemed impossibly far away, but it represented the only escape route left to her. Don't come any closer, she warned, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. I swore an oath to Margaret Whitmore, and I'll die before I break it. The tracker's expression hardened. That can be arranged, he said coldly, drawing his weapon. But the baby comes with us either way. It was at that moment, when all hope seemed lost, and Emma prepared to make her desperate leap, that the barn doors below burst open with a crash that shook the entire structure. The sudden noise startled everyone in the loft, and they turned to look down at the figure silhouetted in the doorway. The man who entered moved with a fluid confidence that spoke of years spent in the saddle and equal time spent handling trouble. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene above him in a single glance. His clothes marked him as a working rancher, practical denim and leather worn smooth by honest labor, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Morning, gentlemen, he called up to the loft, his voice carrying easily through the barn. Seems like you're having quite a gathering in my barn without an invitation. The lead tracker recovered quickly from his surprise. This is official business, Cowboy. Best you move along and pretend you didn't see anything. The rancher below chuckled, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. Well, that's where you're wrong on 2 counts. First, this is my property, which makes everything that happens here my business. Second, I make it a point never to pretend I didn't see a man threatening a woman and a baby. Like I said, official business, the tracker repeated, but Emma could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. We're acting on behalf of Cornelius Blackwood of Denver. Legal guardianship papers, Cornelius Blackwood, the rancher repeated thoughtfully. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. Used to do business with a fellow by that name before I learned better. Found out he had some very particular ideas about how people should be treated. He moved further into the barn, and Emma could see that his hand rested casually on the grip of a well-worn Colt revolver. Funny thing about legal papers, they're only as good as the men enforcing them. And from what I can see, you boys seem to have forgotten your manners. The tracker's face flushed red with anger. Now you listen here. No, the rancher interrupted, his voice taking on a steel edge that cut through the air like a blade. You listen, this is Thomas Riley's land, and these are Thomas Riley's rules. First rule is that nobody threatens women and children on my property. Second rule is that anybody who doesn't like the first rule is welcome to take their business elsewhere. Emma found herself staring down at this Thomas Riley with a mixture of hope and disbelief. After weeks of running and hiding, afraid to trust anyone, she had stumbled into the protection of a complete stranger who seemed willing to stand against Blackwood's men. But she had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and she remained tense, ready to make her desperate leap if this proved to be some elaborate trap. The tracker, clearly frustrated by this unexpected development, decided to try a different approach. Look, Mr. Riley, is it? We're reasonable men, we're willing to compensate you for your trouble. Mr. Blackwood is a generous employer to those who assist him. Thomas Riley's expression didn't change. And what makes you think I need Cornelius Blackwood's money? Every man has his price, the tracker said with renewed confidence. Even honest ranchers can find themselves in need of extra capital. Cattle prices, bad weather, failed crops, there's always something. You're right about one thing, Riley acknowledged. Every man does have his price. The question is what kind of currency he values. His eyes moved upward to meet Emma's gaze directly, and she felt something pass between them, a moment of understanding that transcended their circumstances. Some men value gold, others value something that can't be weighed or measured. The tracker followed Riley's gaze upward and seemed to realize that he was losing control of the situation. His hand moved toward his weapon, but he found himself staring down the barrel of Riley's Colt before he could clear leather. The rancher's draw had been so smooth and swift that it seemed like magic. I wouldn't, Riley said quietly. Like I mentioned, these are my rules and I take them very seriously. For a long moment, the barn was filled with tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Emma held her breath, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever spell was protecting them. Lucy, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, remained perfectly quiet in her arms. Finally, the tracker slowly raised his hands, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "This isn't over, Riley. Mr. Blackwood doesn't give up easily, and he has resources you can't imagine." "I'm sure he does," Riley replied calmly, though his gun never wavered. "But right now, my resources include being on my own land with a clear view of 3 men who are trespassing and threatening my guests. I'd say that gives me a considerable advantage." The word guests sent a shock through Emma. In calling her that, Thomas Riley had just claimed her under his protection, extending the sanctuary of his property to include her and Lucy. It was a gesture that could have far-reaching consequences, but he had made it without hesitation. "Your guests," the tracker snarled. "You don't even know who she is or what she's done." "You're right," Riley admitted. "I don't know her story yet, but I know enough about your employer to understand that any enemy of Cornelius Blackwood is likely someone worth knowing." The implications of that statement hit Emma like a physical blow. Thomas Riley knew Blackwood personally, or at least by reputation, and clearly harbored no love for the man. This wasn't just a case of a good Samaritan helping a stranger. There was history here, complications that she couldn't yet understand. The lead tracker seemed to reach the same conclusion. "So this is personal," he said with satisfaction. "I'll make sure Mr. Blackwood knows that Thomas Riley is harboring his property for reasons of personal vendetta." "You do that," Riley said evenly. "And while you're at it, remind him that the last time he tried to push me around, it didn't work out well for him. Some lessons are worth repeating." The tracker's eyes narrowed dangerously, but he motioned to his men. "We're leaving," he announced. "But this conversation isn't finished." "Yes it is," Riley corrected. "At least it's finished on my land. You boys have about 30 seconds to clear my property line before I decide you're not just trespassing anymore, you're loitering with intent to cause trouble." As the 3 men began their awkward descent from the loft, Emma found herself studying her unlikely protector with new eyes. Thomas Riley was clearly more than just a simple rancher. His easy confidence in the face of armed men, his familiarity with Blackwood's reputation, and most tellingly, his reference to previous confrontations, suggested a past that might be as complicated as her own. The trackers reached the barn floor and moved toward their horses with as much dignity as they could muster, but the lead man couldn't resist one final threat. "The law will be back, Riley. With proper warrants and federal marshals, you can't hide behind property rights forever."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Maybe not," Riley acknowledged, "but I can hide behind them long enough to hear the lady's side of the story. After that, we'll see what needs to be done." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Emma found herself alone in the barn loft with a man who had just risked his own safety to protect her. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and the weight of decisions that would have to be made. Lucy stirred in her arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet barn. "You can come down now," Riley called up to her, his voice gentle but carrying clear authority. "They're gone, at least for the moment." Emma hesitated, torn between gratitude and caution. Every instinct told her that Thomas Riley was different from the men she had been fleeing, but she had learned to be wary of trusting too quickly. Still, she had few options left, and this man had just placed himself between her and Blackwood's trackers without asking for anything in return. Carefully, with Lucy secured in one arm, Emma began the climb down the ladder. Duchess followed with surprising agility for a goat, her burgundy hat still perfectly positioned despite the morning's excitement. When Emma reached the barn floor, she found herself standing face to face with the man who had just changed the course of her story. Up close, Thomas Riley was even more imposing, but his blue eyes held kindness rather than the cold calculation she had learned to fear in men's faces. He studied her with obvious curiosity, taking in her worn clothes, the baby in her arms, and the unusual goat companion, but his expression remained non-judgmental. "That's quite an ensemble you're traveling with," he observed, nodding toward Dutch. "Don't see many goats wearing formal wear in these parts." Despite everything, Emma found herself almost smiling. Duchess came with the hat. It seemed cruel to take it away from her. "Duchess," Riley repeated approvingly. "Good name for a goat with such distinguished taste in millinery." His attention turned to the baby, and his expression softened. "And this little one?" "Lucy," Emma said instinctively, holding the child closer. "She's not." She paused, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger, even one who had just saved them. "She's not yours," Riley finished gently. "I figured as much. The way you hold her, protective but careful, like you're still learning her rhythms." And the way those men talked about legal guardianship suggests there's family complications involved. Emma stared at him in surprise. You're very observant. It's a useful skill in my line of work, he replied. Speaking of which, I don't believe I caught your name. Emma, she said after a moment's hesitation. Emma Mitchell. Well, Miss Mitchell, I think we need to have a conversation about exactly what kind of trouble you've brought to my doorstep. Not because I'm having second thoughts about helping you, he added quickly, seeing her expression, but because I need to know what we're up against if I'm going to do this properly. The weight of those words settled over Emma like a mantle. Thomas Riley was offering more than just temporary sanctuary. He was volunteering to become involved in her struggle against one of the most powerful men in the territory. It was an offer that could change everything, but it also meant revealing secrets she had guarded desperately for weeks. It's a long story, she said. I've got time, Riley replied. And judging by the way those men talked, you're going to need more than just a place to hide. You're going to need an ally. Emma looked down at Lucy, who was beginning to fuss with hunger, then at Duchess, who was investigating the barn's contents with typical goat curiosity. Finally, she met Riley's steady gaze and made a decision that would bind their fates together. Margaret Whitmore was my dearest friend, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She died giving birth to Lucy, but before she passed she made me promise something that's put us all in terrible danger. Thomas Riley listened without interruption as Emma told her story, from Margaret's desperate deathbed plea to the weeks of running from Blackwood's men. She spoke of her friend's marriage to a miner who had defied his wealthy father by wedding for love rather than social advantage, and how that act of rebellion had resulted in both young people being cut off from the family fortune. She described Blackwood's cold calculation in allowing his son to struggle in poverty, apparently believing that hardship would eventually drive the couple apart and send his heir crawling back to Denver. But James Whitmore had proven more stubborn than his father anticipated. Rather than abandon his wife, he had worked harder in the dangerous mines, determined to provide for his growing family through honest labor. That determination had cost him his life when a poorly supported tunnel collapsed, leaving Margaret alone and pregnant with nowhere to turn. She wrote to Blackwood after James died, Emma continued, her voice heavy with remembered sorrow, begging him to help, not for her sake but for the grandchild she was carrying. He wrote back exactly once, saying that if she delivered a healthy heir he would consider allowing the child to be raised properly in Denver, away from the corrupting influence of poverty and unsuitable maternal connections. Riley's jaw tightened. He wanted to take the baby and abandon the mother. Margaret was already sick with consumption by then, Emma said. She knew she wouldn't survive the birth, but she also knew what kind of man Blackwood was. James had told her stories about his childhood, the coldness, the control, the way love was used as a weapon to ensure obedience. She couldn't bear the thought of Lucy growing up in that house. So she asked you to take the child and run. Emma nodded. I was performing in Helena when Margaret sent for me. I hadn't seen her in months, didn't even know she was pregnant. When I arrived she was already in labor, and there was no doctor, just an old woman from the mining camp who did what she could. Emma's voice caught. Margaret held on just long enough to put Lucy in my arms and make me swear an oath. She said I was the only person she trusted to raise her daughter with love instead of duty. The barn fell silent except for the soft sounds of Lucy beginning to fuss more insistently. Emma automatically began to rock the baby, a gesture that had become second nature over the past weeks. Blackwood's men found us in Helena 3 days later, she continued. I barely got out of town ahead of them. Since then we've been moving constantly, sleeping in abandoned buildings, accepting charity when I could find it, taking what I needed when I couldn't. She looked down at her worn clothes. I was never cut out for a life of crime, Mr. Riley. Before this, the most rebellious thing I'd ever done was perform Shakespeare in saloons. Thomas Riley had been listening intently throughout her story, his expression growing more grim with each revelation. When she finished he was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what she had told him. Cornelius Blackwood, he said finally, speaking the name like a curse. I should have known he'd be at the center of something like that. You really do know him, Emma said, though it wasn't quite a question. We have history. Riley confirmed. About 5 years ago he decided he wanted to expand his operations into cattle ranch, started buying up properties throughout Montana and Colorado, usually by making offers that were hard to refuse. When he came after my land I refused anyway. What happened? Riley's smile was cold. He tried the usual tactics, financial pressure, legal challenges, hired men to cause trouble for my cattle and workers. When none of that worked, he got more creative. Started spreading rumors about my past, trying to turn the community against me. Even had men bushwhack me on the trail, though he was careful to make it look like random robbery. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. How did you stop him? I didn't exactly, but I made it clear that continuing his campaign against me would be more expensive than he was willing to pay. Blackwood's a businessman first and foremost, he understands cost versus benefit. When I demonstrated that the cost of taking my ranch would include some very personal consequences for him and his operations, he decided to look for easier targets. The implication of that statement hung heavy in the air. Thomas Riley had not only survived Cornelius Blackwood's attempts to destroy him, he had apparently fought back effectively enough to make the powerful man back down. Emma found herself looking at her protector with new respect and perhaps a touch of fear. What kind of man could stand toe-to-toe with someone like Blackwood and emerge victorious? So when you offered to help me, she said slowly, you knew exactly what you were getting into. I had a pretty good idea, Riley admitted. But knowing Blackwood like I do, I also knew that if he's after that baby, it's not just about family sentiment. There's something else involved, something that makes Lucy valuable enough to spend significant resources hunting her down. Emma frowned. What do you mean? Think about it, Riley said patiently. Blackwood cut his son off completely for marrying your friend. He was willing to let them struggle in poverty, even after a grandchild was on the way. That doesn't sound like a man driven by overwhelming grandfather instincts. But the moment Margaret dies and leaves Lucy in your care, suddenly he's willing to hire trackers and chase you across the territory. Something changed. The terrible logic of his reasoning hit Emma like a physical blow. You think there's more to this than just claiming his granddaughter? I think Cornelius Blackwood doesn't do anything unless there's profit involved. A baby represents responsibility, expense, emotional complications, all things he's shown he's willing to avoid. Unless that baby also represents opportunity. Emma stared down at Lucy, who had finally drifted back to sleep in her arms. What kind of opportunity could a 3-month-old baby represent? That's what we need to figure out, Riley said grimly. But first we need to deal with more immediate concerns. Those men will be back, probably with reinforcements and legitimate legal authority. We need to be ready for them. Emma repeated, hardly daring to hope. Thomas Riley looked at her steadily, and she saw determination in his blue eyes that matched her own desperate resolve. Miss Mitchell, I made Cornelius Blackwood a promise 5 years ago, that if he ever tried to bring his particular brand of business to my land again, he'd regret. Seems like fate has given me an opportunity to keep that promise. You don't owe me anything, Emma said softly. I brought this trouble to your door. You've already done more than enough by stopping those men from taking Lucy. Maybe, Riley acknowledged. But here's the thing about promises, Miss Mitchell. The important ones aren't made to be convenient. They're made to be kept, regardless of the cost. He gestured toward the baby in her arm. You made a promise to your friend, and you've been keeping it even though it's cost you everything you had. I respect that kind of integrity. Emma felt tears threaten for the first time since fleeing Helena. For weeks she had been carrying the weight of Margaret's dying request alone, making impossible decisions and sacrifices with no one to share the burden. The simple acknowledgement that her struggles meant something, that her promise had value, was almost overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Riley warned. If we're going to do this right, there are conditions you'll need to accept. Emma stiffened, remembering too well how conditions and bargains had shaped her life recently. What kind of condition? Thomas Riley studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring her character against some internal standard. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Stay, he said simply. If this is going to work, if we're going to protect Lucy and honor your promise to Margaret, you can't keep running. Blackwood's men will never stop chasing you as long as you're alone and vulnerable. But if you stay here, on my land, under my protection, then this becomes a different kind of fight. Emma felt her heart race. Stay was exactly what she had been afraid to do anywhere. The one thing that seemed impossible given the relentless pursuit she had endured. But there was something in Riley's tone, something in the way he stood and the confidence in his bearing, that made the impossible seem merely difficult. For how long? She asked. As long as it takes, he replied. Until we figure out what Blackwood really wants and find a way to stop him permanently. Until Lucy is safe and your promise to Margaret is truly fulfilled. The offer was everything Emma had dreamed of during the long, sleepless nights of their flight. Safety, protection, a chance to raise Lucy properly instead of constantly looking over her shoulder. But it was also terrifying in its implication. Staying meant trusting this man completely, putting not just her own fate but Lucy's future in his hands. And if I agree, she said carefully, what would you expect in return? Riley's expression grew thoughtful. Honesty, he said finally, complete honesty about everything, your past, Margaret's secrets, anything that might help us understand what we're really facing. I can't protect you from dangers I don't understand, Emma nodded slowly. That seemed reasonable, though she wondered if Thomas Riley would still be willing to help once he learned some of the more complicated details of her story. Anything else? Trust, he said simply. If you stay, you'll need to trust my judgment about how to handle Blackwood and his men. I know how he operates, and I know what works against him, but that only matters if you're willing to follow my lead instead of acting on fear or desperation. The word trust hung between them like a bridge over a chasm. Emma had learned the hard way that trusting the wrong person could be fatal, but she had also learned that refusing to trust anyone at all was a different kind of death. She looked down at Lucy, then at Duchess, who had settled contentedly in a pile of clean straw and seemed to approve of their new surroundings. There's one more condition, Riley added, and Emma's attention snapped back to him. Yet, a hint of something that might have been amusement flickered in his blue eyes. It tips to ladies. Emma stared at him in confusion. I'm sorry? The condition, he said, nodding toward Duchess. Your goat's hat. I've been watching it since you climbed down from the loft, and I swear it tips slightly toward every woman it encounters, like a gentleman acknowledging a lady's presence. Emma looked at Duchess more carefully and realized that Riley was right. The little burgundy hat did seem to sit at a subtle angle, creating the impression that the goat was perpetually tipping her hat in polite greeting. It was such an absurd observation, so far removed from the life and death struggles of the morning, that Emma found herself laughing for the first time in weeks. You want me to stay because my goat has good manners? She asked, hardly believing the surreal turn the conversation had taken. I want you to stay because you need protection and I have the means to provide it, Riley corrected. But his eyes were still twinkling with that hint of humor. But I'll admit, a goat with social graces seems like the kind of detail that might bring good luck to the whole enterprise. Emma looked around the barn that had sheltered them from pursuit, at the man who had risked his own safety to protect strangers, at the baby who represented both her greatest responsibility and her most precious trust. The decision should have been agonizing, weighed down by all the potential consequences and complications. Instead, it felt surprisingly simple. Then we'll stay, she said, meeting his gaze directly. All three of us, with complete honesty and trust, for as long as it. Thomas Riley smiled, and Emma realized it was the first truly warm expression she had seen from him. In that case, welcome to the Thornfield Ranch, Miss Mitchell. I think this is going to be an interesting partnership. As if in agreement, Duchess gave a soft bleat and somehow managed to make her burgundy hat bob in what could only be described as an approving nod. And despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the powerful enemies who would certainly return, Emma found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, they had found not just sanctuary but the beginning of something that could actually solve their impossible situation. The morning sun was rising higher now, burning off the mist and revealing the full scope of the ranch that had become their refuge. In the distance, Emma could see the main house, a solid wooden structure that spoke of prosperity and permanence. There were corrals and outbuildings, signs of a working operation that had been built to last, but it was the man standing beside her who represented the real change in their circumstance. Thomas Riley had offered them more than shelter. He had offered them alliance in a fight that could determine Lucy's entire future, and something in his steady presence, in the confidence with which he had faced down Blackwood's men, made Emma believe that for the first time since Margaret's death, they might actually have a chance of winning. The stage was set for the real battle to begin, but Emma no longer felt like she was facing it alone. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. The traveling performer turned reluctant guardian, the rancher with secrets of his own, the innocent baby who had become the center of a powerful man's schemes, and a goat in a burgundy hat, who somehow managed to maintain her dignity through everything. It was, Emma thought as they walked toward the ranch house, either the beginning of their salvation, or the most elaborate preparation for disaster she had ever encountered. But for the first time in weeks, she was willing to hope that it might be the former. The morning sun climbed higher over the Thornfield Ranch, as Emma followed Thomas Riley across the sprawling property toward the main house. Lucy had fallen into a peaceful sleep against her shoulder, while Duchess trotted alongside them with her burgundy hat maintaining its perpetual air of dignified greeting. The ranch buildings looked substantial and well maintained, speaking of years of careful stewardship and prosperity earned through honest work. Emma found herself studying her protector as they walked, trying to understand the man who had just altered the course of her desperate flight. Thomas Riley moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his environment, but there were layers beneath that casual demeanor that intrigued her. The way he had handled Blackwood's men suggested experience with violence, yet his manner with her had been consistently gentle. The reverence in his voice, when he spoke of promises and integrity, indicated deep personal principles, but his obvious familiarity with Cornelius Blackwood's methods hinted at a past that might not have always been so straightforward. The ranch house itself proved to be even more impressive up close than it had appeared from a distance. Built of solid timber with a wide wraparound porch, It had the kind of permanent, established look that spoke of roots put down deep. Flower boxes beneath the windows showed evidence of careful tending, though Emma noticed they contained practical herbs alongside decorative blooms. Everything about the place suggested a man who valued both beauty and utility, who had built something meant to endure. As they approached the front steps, a woman emerged from the kitchen door, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent dark eyes that took in the unusual group with obvious curiosity. Her dress was simple but well made, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who managed an important household. "Thomas," she called out, her voice carrying a slight accent that Emma couldn't quite place. "I saw riders heading away from the property. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine now, Rosa," Riley replied, his tone warm with obvious affection and respect. "We have guests who'll be staying with us for a while. This is Miss Emma Mitchell, and the little one is Lucy. The distinguished lady with the hat is Dutch." Rosa's eyes crinkled with amusement as she took in Duchess, but her expression grew more serious as she studied Emma's worn clothes and exhausted features. "Guests who've been traveling hard, from the look of things. Come inside, child. You look ready to drop." Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the woman's matter-of-fact kindness. After weeks of suspicious stares and hostile encounters, Rosa's immediate acceptance felt like a gift. "Thank you. I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Rosa interrupted briskly. "This house is meant for hospitality. Besides, any friend of Thomas's is welcome here, and any woman traveling alone with a baby has earned whatever help we can provide." As they entered the house, Emma was struck by the warmth and comfort of the interior. The rooms were spacious but not ostentatious, furnished with well-crafted pieces that showed signs of daily use rather than display. Books lined the shelves in the main room, and she could see evidence of various interests: ranching manuals, volumes of poetry, works on agriculture and animal husbandry. It was the home of a man who valued learning as much as practical success. "Rosa manages the household," Riley explained as they settled in the main room. "She's been with the ranch for 3 years now, and I don't know what I'd do without her. Rosa, Miss Mitchell and Lucy are going to be staying with us indefinitely. They're under my protection." Something in his tone conveyed the seriousness of that protection, and Rosa nodded with understanding. Emma realized that this wasn't the first time the ranch had provided sanctuary for someone in need, and she felt another wave of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place. "The baby will need feeding," Rosa observed, noting Lucy's restless stirring, "and you look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. Let me get some warm milk and see what we can do about both situations." As Rosa bustled away toward the kitchen, Emma found herself alone with Thomas Riley for the first time since their dramatic encounter in the barn. The weight of her decision to stay, to trust this man with Lucy's safety, settled over her with new force. Now that they were in the domestic tranquility of his home. "She seems wonderful," Emma said, nodding toward the kitchen where Rosa's voice could be heard giving instructions to unseen staff. "Rosa's one of the finest people I've ever known," Riley agreed. "She came to us after her husband died in a mining accident up in Butte, had nowhere else to go and no family to take her in. I needed someone to manage the household. She needed work and security. It's worked out well for everyone." Emma heard the echo of her own story in Rosa's circumstances, another woman who had found refuge at the Thornfield Ranch after tragedy struck. "You make a habit of helping women in difficult situations." Riley's expression grew thoughtful. "I make a habit of helping people who deserve help, regardless of their circumstances, but I'll admit, I have particular sympathy for those who've been left to face the world alone through no fault of their own." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such situations, but before Emma could explore that further, Rosa returned with a bottle of warm milk and a plate of fresh bread and cheese. Lucy accepted the feeding eagerly, and Emma realized how long it had been since she had been able to provide the baby with adequate nutrition. "Now then," Rosa said, settling into a chair across from them, "while the little one eats, perhaps you'd like to tell us how you came to be hiding in our barn with a goat in a hat." Emma glanced at Thomas Riley, who nodded encouragingly. She had promised complete honesty as part of their agreement, and she could see that Rosa was someone who would need to understand the situation if she was going to help protect Lucy. Over the next hour, Emma repeated the story she had told in the barn, filling in additional details about her friendship with Margaret, the circumstances of James Whitmore's death, and the increasingly desperate flight from Blackwood's men. Rosa listened without interruption, her expression growing more grave as the tale progressed. "Cornelius Blackwood," Rosa said when Emma finished, speaking the name with obvious distaste. "I've heard that name before. Nothing good if I recall correct." "Rosa worked in Denver for several years before coming here," Riley explained. "She has first-hand knowledge of how certain powerful men operate in this territory." "I worked for the Pemberton family," Rosa said, her voice carefully neutral. "They moved in the same social circles as the Blackwoods.
I saw enough to know that Cornelius Blackwood treats people like possessions, to be acquired or discarded as it suits his purposes. If he's after that baby, it's not because he's suddenly developed paternal instinct. Emma felt a chill at the confirmation of what Thomas Riley had suggested earlier. Then you think there's something else involved? I think Cornelius Blackwood doesn't spend money unless he expects to make money, Rosa replied bluntly. A 3-month-old baby represents years of expense and responsibility, unless she also represents some kind of asset or opportunity that outweighs those costs. Thomas Riley leaned forward in his chair. What kind of opportunity could a baby represent? Inheritance rights may. Rosa shook her head. James Whitmore was disinherited when he married Margaret. Cornelius made sure of that, had his lawyers draw up papers specifically excluding James and any potential heirs from the family fortune. I remember hearing about it at the time because it caused quite a scandal in Denver society. Emma stared at Rosa in confusion. Then why would he want Lucy, if she has no legal claim to his wealth? Unless something has changed, Rosa interrupted thoughtfully. Some development that makes Lucy valuable in ways that weren't true when her father was alive. The three adults sat in contemplative silence, each trying to puzzle out what could have transformed Lucy from an unwanted reminder of family rebellion into something worth pursuing across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. The baby herself remained blissfully unaware of their speculation, contentedly finishing her bottle and beginning to drift toward sleep. It was Thomas Riley who finally voiced what they were all beginning to suspect. We need more information about Blackwood's current business interests, his family situation, anything that might have changed recently, and we need to understand exactly what legal rights he might claim regarding Lucy. How do we get that kind of information? Emma asked. It's not like we can write to Denver and ask for details about Cornelius Blackwood's private affairs. Rosa and Thomas Riley exchanged a meaningful look, and Emma sensed some unspoken communication passing between them. Actually, Rosa said carefully, we might have more resources than you realize. Thomas, remember what you told me about your friend in Denver, the one who works for the territorial government? Riley nodded slowly. Marcus Webb. He's a clerk in the Territorial Records Office, but he has access to legal filings, property transfers, that sort of thing. If there have been changes in Blackwood's situation that affect Lucy's status, Marcus might be able to find out. You do that? Emma asked, hardly daring to hope. Contact your friend on our behalf. It's not just on your behalf, Riley replied seriously. If Blackwood is willing to violate my property rights and threaten women and children to get what he wants, then this affects me too. I have a vested interest in understanding exactly what we're dealing with.
Emma felt tears threaten again at this continued generosity from people who owed her nothing. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank us by taking care of yourself and Lucy, Rosa interrupted practically. You're exhausted and that baby needs stability and proper nutrition. Let us worry about gathering information while you focus on recovery. As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy chose that moment to wake fully and begin the restless fussing that Emma had learned indicated the need for a diaper change. Rosa immediately rose from her chair. I'll show you to your room, she said. I've prepared the guest bedroom at the front of the house. It has good light and a comfortable chair for feeding times. There's also a small adjoining room that we can set up as a nursery for Lucy. Emma followed Rosa upstairs, marveling at the continued kindness of these strangers who were treating her like family rather than an unwelcome burden. The guest room proved to be spacious and well appointed, with a large window overlooking the ranch's main approach. Rosa pointed out the practical considerations: fresh linens, a wash basin with clean water and a chest of drawers that had been emptied for Emma's use. I took the liberty of gathering some clothes that might fit you, Rosa said, gesturing toward a neat pile on the bed. Nothing fancy but clean and practical. We can make adjustments as needed. Emma stared at the simple dresses and undergarments, realizing that she had been wearing the same traveling outfit for weeks. The prospect of clean clothes and a proper bath seemed almost impossibly luxurious. Rosa, she said softly, why are you being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me except what I've told you in the last hour. Rosa paused in her bustling arrangements and looked at Emma directly. I know enough, she said simply. I know you've sacrificed everything to honor a promise to a dying friend. I know you've put yourself in danger to protect a child who isn't even your own blood. I know you've been carrying an impossible burden alone, and now you're finally somewhere safe enough to set it down for a while. The older woman's expression softened, but mostly I know what it feels like to have nowhere else to turn, and I know how Thomas Riley responds to people in that situation. This ranch has become a place where people can rebuild their lives, and you're not the first person to find refuge here. Emma felt a deep curiosity about what other stories of refuge and rebuilding had played out in this house, but she sensed that Rosa's revelations would come in their own time. For now, it was enough to know that she and Lucy were not anomalies but part of a pattern of generosity that spoke well of Thomas Riley's character. After Rosa left her to settle in, Emma spent several minutes simply standing at the window, watching the peaceful activity of the ranch. Cowboys moved between the corrals and outbuildings with purposeful efficiency, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pasture. It was a world removed from the theaters and concert halls where she had spent her professional life. But there was something deeply appealing about the ordered productivity of it all. Lucy, meanwhile, had been placed in a makeshift cradle that someone had thoughtfully provided, and she seemed to approve of the stable environment. Duchess had taken up residence in a corner of the room, having somehow managed to navigate the stairs without losing her hat, and appeared to be conducting a careful inspection of their new quarters. Emma was just beginning to appreciate the luxury of having time to think beyond immediate survival when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Her blood turned cold as she recognized the thunder of hoofbeats that had haunted her dreams for weeks, and she moved quickly to the window to look out. What she saw made her heart sink. At least a dozen riders were approaching the ranch house, led by a man she didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested official authority. Unlike the rough trackers who had cornered her in the barn, these men wore badges and carried themselves with the confidence of legitimate law enforcement. Emma grabbed Lucy from her cradle and backed away from the window, her mind racing through impossible options. They had found her again, despite Thomas Riley's protection, and this time they had brought enough force to overwhelm any resistance. The brief respite she had enjoyed suddenly seemed like a cruel joke, a moment of false hope before the inevitable capture. Heavy footsteps on the front porch were followed by an authoritative knock on the door. Emma could hear Thomas Riley's voice responding, though she couldn't make out the words from her position upstairs. The conversation continued for several minutes, punctuated by other voices that she assumed belonged to the office. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, and her heart hammered against her ribs as she prepared for the worst. But it was Rosa who appeared in the doorway, her expression tense but not panicked. "They have a warrant," Rosa said without preamble. "Federal marshals acting on a complaint filed by Cornelius Blackwood alleging kidnapping and theft. They want to search the house and take custody of Lucy." Emma felt the world tilt around her. What did Thomas tell them? The truth, as far as it goes. That you're a guest on his property, that you've committed no crimes in his presence, and that any search of his home will be conducted according to proper legal procedures. Rosa moved closer, lowering her voice. "But Emma, you need to understand, if they find you with Lucy, they have the legal authority to take her." Blackwood's lawyers have been very thorough. The weight of her failure crashed down on Emma with devastating force. After all the running, all the sacrifices, all the hope that Thomas Riley's protection might make a difference, she was still going to lose Lucy to Cornelius Blackwood's machination. Margaret's dying wish would go unfulfilled, and the baby would disappear into a world of cold calculation and manipulation. "There has to be something we can do," Emma whispered desperately. "Some legal challenge, some way to prove that Blackwood isn't acting in Lucy's best interests." "Maybe," Rosa said carefully, "but not today, and not with federal marshals standing in our front hall with valid warrants. Today we need to focus on buying time." Emma stared at the older woman, trying to understand what she was suggesting. "What do you mean?" Rosa moved to the window and looked down at the assembled officers. "Thomas is insisting on examining their warrants carefully, questioning their jurisdiction, demanding to see proper identification. He's buying us as much time as he can, but it won't last long." "Time for what?" Rosa turned back to Emma with an expression that was both determined and apologetic. "Time for you to disappear again, with Lucy." The suggestion hit Emma like a physical blow. "But Thomas said I should stay." "Thomas said you should stay if we could make it work," Rosa corrected gently. "But circumstances have changed. Blackwood moved faster than we anticipated, and he came with more legal authority than Thomas expected. Sometimes strategic retreat is the only option." Emma looked down at Lucy, who was beginning to fuss with hunger again, blissfully unaware that her future hung in the balance. The thought of returning to the desperate flight of the past weeks, of losing the safety and support she had just found, was almost unbearable, but the alternative was worse. "Where would we go?" she asked, hating the defeat in her own voice. "North," Rosa said immediately. "There's an old mining camp about 20 miles from here, mostly abandoned but with a few buildings still standing. You could hide there while we work on a more permanent solution." Rosa's expression grew fierce. "Did you think we'd just let you disappear again without help?" "Thomas Riley doesn't abandon people who've accepted his protection, and neither do I, but we need to be smart about this." Before Emma could respond, they heard Thomas Riley's voice from downstairs, raised in what sounded like an argument with the lead marshal. The discussion was growing more heated,
and Emma realized that her time was running out. "There's a back staircase that leads to the kitchen," Rosa said urgently. "I can get you out that way while Thomas keeps them occupied with legal objections, but you need to move now." Emma's mind reeled with the speed at which her circumstances had changed yet again. An hour ago she had been settling into what felt like permanent sanctuary. Now she was preparing for another desperate escape, this time from federal officers, rather than hired trackers. "What about supply? Food, clothes for Lucy, already packed," Rosa interrupted, pulling a traveling bag from behind the door. "Basic necessities, enough to last several days. There's also some money, not much, but enough for immediate need." Emma stared at the bag, realizing that Rosa had been preparing for this possibility even while welcoming them into the house. "You knew this might happen. I hoped it wouldn't," Rosa replied honestly. "But Thomas and I have learned that when you're dealing with powerful enemies, it's wise to prepare for multiple scenarios." The sound of boots on the front stairs galvanized them both into action. Rosa grabbed Duchess, who seemed to understand the urgency and cooperated with being carried, while Emma gathered Lucy and the traveling bag. They moved quickly toward the back of the house, using servants' passages that Emma hadn't even known existed. The kitchen was empty except for a young woman who looked up from her bread preparation with obvious concern. Rosa nodded to her, and the girl immediately moved to the window to keep watch on the front of the house. "Coast is clear," the girl whispered. "They're all still arguing with Miss Riley in the front hall." Rosa led Emma to a door that opened onto a small herb garden behind the kitchen. From there they could see a path that led through a grove of cottonwood trees toward what appeared to be a small outbuilding. "Follow that path to the old smokehouse," Rosa instructed. "There's a horse waiting there, saddled and ready. The trail north is clearly marked, and you should reach the mining camp by nightfall if you push hard." Emma felt tears threatening as she realized she was leaving these kind people behind, possibly forever. "Rosa, I don't know how to." "Don't," Rosa interrupted firmly. "Save your thanks for when we've actually solved this problem. This is just the first step." The older woman pressed a folded paper into Emma's hand. "Instructions for finding the camp, and a message for Jake Morrison if he's there. Jake's an old friend of Thomas's, and he'll help you get settled." Emma nodded, clutching Lucy close as they prepared to leave the safety of the kitchen. But before they could move, the young girl at the window turned with alarm. "They're coming around to the back," she hit. "Two of them, checking the other exits." Rosa cursed under her breath, a word that Emma would never have expected from the dignified housekeeper. "They're more thorough than I hoped." The sound of heavy boots on the back porch sent all three women into motion. Rosa quickly opened a door that Emma had assumed led to a pantry, revealing instead a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Root cellar," Rosa explained quickly. "It connects to the old tunnel system that the original owner built during Indian trouble. You can follow it to the creek, then circle back to the smokehouse once they've moved on." Emma stared into the dark passageway, fighting down claustrophobia and the fear of being trapped underground. But the sound of marshals testing the back door left her no choice. She kissed Rosa's cheek quickly in gratitude, then descended into the tunnel with Lucy and Duchess. The passage was narrow and low, carved directly out of the earth and shored up with timber beams. It smelled of root vegetables and old earth, but it was dry and seemed structurally sound. Emma moved carefully in the darkness, one hand on the wall for guidance, the other supporting Lucy, who had begun to cry softly in protest at their surrounding. Behind her she could hear muffled voices as the marshals entered the kitchen, followed by Rosa's perfectly calm responses to their question. The older woman was claiming ignorance of any guests, while offering the officers refreshments with such convincing hospitality that Emma found herself almost believing the performance. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, but eventually Emma saw light ahead and emerged into a small cave-like opening beside Cedar Creek. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, and she realized how much time had passed since their peaceful morning in the barn. Lucy was crying more insistently now, hungry and disturbed by the constant upheaval, and Duchess seemed equally distressed by their underground journey. Emma took a moment to orient herself, using Rosa's instructions to identify the route that would take her around to the smokehouse, without being seen from the main house. The path was rough and overgrown, clearly not used regularly, but it provided cover from observation. When she finally reached the small outbuilding, she found exactly what Rosa had promised, a sturdy mare saddled and equipped with supplies for the journey north. There was even a makeshift carrier that would allow her to secure Lucy safely for the ride, and a lead rope for Duchess, who seemed resigned to another change in their circumstances. As Emma prepared to mount the horse, she paused for one last look at the ranch house that had briefly represented sanctuary. She could see the marshal's horses still gathered in front, and she knew that Thomas Riley was inside fighting a legal battle he couldn't win. The knowledge that he was sacrificing his own standing with federal authorities for her sake filled her with guilt and gratitude in equal measure, but there was no time for extended farewells or second-guessing. Emma secured Lucy in the carrier, took the lead rope for Duchess, and guided the mare toward the trail that Rosa had described. Within minutes, the Thornfield Ranch had disappeared behind a line of hills, and they were once again fugitives heading into an uncertain future. The ride north proved to be both easier and more difficult than Emma had anticipated. The trail was well marked and the mare was sure-footed, making good time despite the challenging terrain. But Lucy's crying grew more distressed as the afternoon wore on, and Emma knew the baby needed proper feeding and rest soon. Duchess, surprisingly, seemed to adapt well to traveling alongside the horse, her burgundy hat somehow remaining perfectly positioned, despite the jostling pace. The goat's calm demeanor provided an odd sort of comfort, a reminder that they had survived worse journeys and might survive this one as well. As the sun began to set, Emma finally saw smoke rising from what appeared to be a small settlement in a valley ahead. The mining camp that Rosa had described was more substantial than she had expected. Several buildings clustered around what had once been active mining operations, with clear signs that some of them were still occupied. Emma approached cautiously, aware that not all inhabitants of abandoned mining camps were necessarily friendly to strangers. But as she drew closer, a man emerged from the largest building and waved a greeting.
He was perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years working in the mountains, but his smile seemed genuine. "You'd be Emma Mitchell," he called out as she dismounted. "Rosa sent word you might be coming our way." Emma stared at him in confusion. "But how?" "Jake Morrison," the man introduced himself, extending his hand in greeting. "And before you ask how I knew you were coming, Thomas Riley has ways of getting messages where they need to go faster than you might expect. Had a rider here an hour ago with instructions to expect you and the little one." Emma felt a surge of renewed gratitude for the thoroughness of her protectors. Even while dealing with federal marshals and legal complications, Thomas Riley had been thinking ahead to ensure her safety. "Is it safe here?" she asked, looking around at the scattered buildings and the deepening shadows of evening. "Safe as anywhere can be for someone in your situation," Jake replied honestly. "Remote enough that casual visitors don't come by often, but with enough residents that you won't be completely isolated. Most of the folks here value privacy and don't ask too many questions about other people's business." He gestured toward Lucy, who had finally stopped crying and was looking around with drowsy curiosity. "Let's get that baby fed and settled, then we can talk about longer-term arrangement." Emma followed Jake toward the main building, which proved to be a combination general store, boarding house, and informal community center. The interior was rough but clean, with a large common room warmed by a stone fireplace and several smaller rooms that served as sleeping quarters for transient residents. A woman perhaps 10 years younger than Jake emerged from what appeared to be a kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron and studying Emma with frank curiosity. "This is my wife Mary," Jake said. "She's been looking forward to having another woman around the place, especially one with a baby to fuss over." Mary Morrison proved to be as practical and welcoming as Rosa had been, immediately taking charge of Lucy's needs while providing Emma with hot food and a comfortable place to rest. Within an hour, the baby was fed, changed, and sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle that Mary had prepared, while Duchess had been provided with food and shelter in a small barn behind the main building. As Emma finally had a chance to sit by the fire with a cup of coffee, Jake filled her in on the immediate situation. "Thomas sent word that the marshals executed their search warrant, but didn't find what they were looking for," he reported. "They're not giving up though. Word is they're planning to expand their search to include neighboring properties and known associates." Emma's heart sank. "So it's only a matter of time before they track us here." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, "but Thomas is working on something that might change the whole situation. He's got his friend in Denver digging into Blackwood's recent activities, and Rosa thinks they might have found something significant." "What kind of something?" Jake shrugged. "Don't know the details yet, but Thomas sent word that we should be prepared for developments within the next few days. Could be good news, could be complicated news, but definitely news that changes the game." Emma stared into the fire, trying to process this latest information. After months of running from Blackwood's influence, the idea that there might be some development that could change their fundamental situation seemed almost too good to hope for. "In the meantime," Jake continued, "you're welcome to stay here as long as needed. We've got room. Mary enjoys the company, and most of our neighbors are the kind of people who understand that sometimes good folks need a place to lay low for a while." Emma looked around the comfortable common room, at Mary Morrison humming softly while she prepared bread for the next day's meals, at the peaceful scene of domestic tranquility that seemed so far removed from the federal marshals and legal warrants that had shattered her morning. "Jake," she said finally, "can I ask you something? Course, how many people has Thomas Riley helped this way? People in situations like mine, I mean." Jake was quiet for a long moment,
clearly considering how much to reveal. Enough, he said finally. Thomas doesn't talk about it much, but this valley has seen its share of folks who needed a second chance or a safe place to start over. Some stay in the area, some move on once they get back on their feet, but I've never known him to turn away someone who genuinely needed help. Why does he do it? What's his story? Jake's expression grew more guarded. That's not really my story to tell, but I will say this. Thomas Riley understands what it's like to have everything you care about threatened by people with more power and fewer scruples. He's made it his business to even the odds when he can. Emma nodded, sensing that she had learned as much as Jake was willing to share, but the knowledge that Thomas Riley's generosity came from personal experience rather than abstract charity made her feel even more grateful for his protection. As the evening deepened and the other residents of the mining camp settled in for the night, Emma found herself sitting by the dying fire with Lucy sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly consider what it might mean if Thomas Riley's mysterious plan actually worked. If there was some way to permanently resolve the threat that Cornelius Blackwood represented, the possibility of a normal life raising Lucy in safety, perhaps even returning to some form of her theatrical career once the child was older, seemed like an impossible dream. But as she looked down at the baby's peaceful face, Emma allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the story that had begun with Margaret's desperate plea might have a happy ending after all. Outside, the mountain night settled over the abandoned mining camp with a kind of profound silence that only exists far from civilization. Emma fell asleep in her chair by the fire, Lucy secure in her arms and Duchess settled nearby, all three of them finally able to rest without the constant fear of pursuit that had haunted their weeks of flight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight they were safe, protected by good people who asked for nothing in return except the chance to help. And somewhere to the south, Emma knew that Thomas Riley was working to ensure that this refuge would become something more permanent, a real sanctuary where Lucy could grow up free from the shadow of Cornelius Blackwood's ambition. The stage was set for whatever revelation would determine their ultimate fate, but for the first time since Margaret's death, Emma felt genuine hope that the story might end with victory rather than tragedy. 3 days later, Emma was feeding Lucy by the morning fire when Jake burst through the door with urgent news. "Rider coming up the trail fast," he announced. "It's one of Thomas's men." The cowboy who dismounted moments later was dusty from hard travel but grinning with excitement. "Miss Mitchell," he called out, "Mr. Riley needs you back at the ranch immediately. We found it, the reason Blackwood wants the baby." Emma's heart hammered as she gathered Lucy and their few belongings. The ride back to Thornfield Ranch seemed endless, but finally the familiar buildings came into view. Thomas Riley stood waiting on the porch, holding a thick envelope and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "Emma," he said as she dismounted, "meet Lucy's inheritance." He held up official-looking documents. Cornelius Blackwood's older brother died in San Francisco last month, left everything to his closest living heir, which isn't Cornelius, it's Lucy. Emma stared at him in shock. "Lucy inherits from her great-uncle $20 million in gold mining investments," Rosa added, emerging from the house, "but only if she lives to claim it. If anything happens to Lucy before she comes of age, the inheritance passes to the next male heir, Cornelius Blackwood." The terrible logic finally made sense. Blackwood hadn't suddenly developed paternal feelings. He had discovered that the granddaughter he'd dismissed was now worth a fortune, but only if she died before reaching majority. "He's been planning to kill her," Emma whispered in horror. "Not directly," Thomas replied grimly. "Too obvious. But accidents happen to children, especially those raised in harsh frontier conditions without proper care. He just needed legal custody to control when and how those accidents occurred." Emma held Lucy closer, sickened by the coldness of Blackwood's scheme. "What do we do?" Thomas smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "We beat him at his own game. I've contacted the territorial judge who handles inheritance cases. With proper legal representation, and documented evidence of Blackwood's intentions, we can have Lucy declared a ward of the court under protective custody. She'll be safe until she's old enough to claim her inheritance properly. But the federal marshals will find their warrants mysteriously invalid once the territorial court asserts jurisdiction." Thomas finished. Blackwood overplayed his hand by bringing federal authority into what's actually a territorial matter. Emma felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time in months. "You really think this will work?" "I think Cornelius Blackwood just discovered that threatening children on my property was the worst mistake he ever made," Thomas replied. "But Emma, there's something else, something I need to ask you." His tone grew serious, almost hesitant. "This legal battle could take months, maybe years. Lucy will need stability, a real home, people who love her. I was wondering," he paused, running his hand through his hair. "This ranch is too big for just one person. Has been for years. I've been thinking it needs a family." Emma's breath caught. "Thomas, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I've grown attached to having you here, you and Lucy both. Rosa tells me you've got a talent for organization, and I've seen how you handle crisis. This place could use a woman's touch, someone who understands that sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in cattle or acres. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I'm saying that maybe Lucy isn't the only one who's found a home here. If you'd consider making it permanent. Emma stared at the ring box, her mind reeling. You're proposing? I'm proposing a partnership, Thomas said carefully. Business, if that's all you want. But I'm hoping for more. I'm hoping for a chance to build something together. A real family for Lucy. A real future for all of us. Emma looked down at Lucy, who was gazing up at her with solemn baby eyes, then at Rosa, who was beaming with approval, then back at Thomas Riley, the man who had risked everything to protect them. Yes, she said simply, to all of it. The partnership, the family, the future. Yes. 6 months later, Emma stood on the porch of the Thornfield Ranch, watching her husband teach their adopted daughter to wave at Duchess, who performed her perpetual hat-tipping greeting with dignified enthusiasm. The legal battles were over. Cornelius Blackwood had withdrawn his claims rather than face criminal charges for conspiracy and attempted fraud. Lucy's inheritance was secure in trust until her 18th birthday, managed by a court-appointed guardian who happened to be a close friend of Judge Morrison. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Emma's theatrical background proved invaluable in organizing community events and managing the business correspondence, while Thomas expanded their operations with innovative techniques, gleaned from his extensive library. Duchess is getting gray around the muzzle, Thomas observed, joining Emma on the porch. Think she's earned a retirement from hat duty. Emma laughed, watching the goat maintain perfect posture despite her advancing years. I think Duchess will wear that hat until her last day. Some traditions are too important to abandon. Thomas slipped his arm around his wife's waist, and they stood together watching their unconventional family enjoy the peaceful evening. In the distance, cattle grazed contentedly, and smoke rose from Rosa's kitchen, where dinner preparations were underway. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully, when you first arrived with nothing but a baby and a goat in a hat, I thought you were the most impractical woman I'd ever met, and now I think you were exactly what this place needed. What I needed. Sometimes the most valuable things come in unexpected packages. Emma smiled, remembering Margaret's dying wish and how far they'd all traveled from that desperate moment. Lucy gurgled happily in Thomas's arms, reaching chubby fingers toward Duchess's hat, and Emma knew that some promises, once kept, create blessings that echo through generations. As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the family that had been forged from desperation and hope settled in for another peaceful evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunity, but they would face them together. The former performer who had learned that love was the greatest role she'd ever play, the rancher who had discovered that the best partnerships were built on shared values rather than convenience, the baby who would grow up surrounded by people who chose to love her, and a dignified goat whose burgundy hat had become a symbol of grace under pressure. Some stories begin with loss and fear, but the best ones end with love and hope. And in a valley where courage met kindness, where books met experience, and where a woman's promise to a dying friend became the foundation for a lifetime of happiness, 3 humans and 1 remarkably well-dressed goat proved that families are made not by blood alone, but by the choices we make to protect and cherish each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.